Well, Queensland health authorities today have been forced to apologise to the family of the deceased man, Nathan Turner, after it was found the 30-year-old did not die from coronavirus as was originally diagnosed. Joining me now, Queensland opposition leader Deb Frecklington in Brisbane. Deb, the Premier has apologised today. We'll just have a listen. We'll just have a listen to her apology.
Of course, we're very sorry for the distress that the family is going through at the moment and has experienced. And to the people of Blackwater, thank you very much for cooperating, and we have to take the advice of health at the time, and that rapid response was deployed.
What did you make of her apology, Deb Frecklington?
Well, look, the buck stops with the Premier, Peter, and in this case, it is so distressing for the family, for the Blackwater community, and in fact for all of Queenslanders, because the question that the Premier needs to answer is how can Queenslanders have confidence in the testing regime in Queensland right now?
I'll get to a High Court challenge because, you know, the testing regime and the health officials in Queensland being on top of their brief is very much related to the capacity of the state to say it must then keep borders closed to keep on top of the virus. But I've got to ask the question, you know, this is a clear failure by Queensland Health. We've seen protection failures in relation to children, to recent horrific cases. Firstly, there was the death of that lovely little 4-year-old Willow Dunn. Her father's been charged with murder after her severely malnourished body was found last Monday. Then there was the discovery of the 2 teenagers with autism locked in a room. Their father had passed away. They were severely malnourished. And a report finding today in relation to Mason Jet Li. It seems like no one's taking responsibility for these social policy arms of the government here. You've got health, and now you've got all of these litany of failures in relation to child protection. What's going on in Queensland?
Well, Peter, what's going on in Queensland is we have got a Premier who just has lost control of her government. In relation to the child safety system here in Queensland, it has just been a terrible case of the coronial inquest has been handed down today in relation to poor little Mason Jet Li. Now, it is a damning report for the Palaszczuk government. What it says is that the Palaszczuk government have effectively ignored the decisions that were made by the Carmody inquest that was put in by the former LNP government, that this Palaszczuk government has failed to abide by those recommendations made by Carmody, and that was 7 years ago. Now, what the Premier has failed to do is keep the children who are in care in Queensland safe, and we've seen it after a litany of disasters in the child protection system. We've now up to the second incompetent child protection minister in Queensland. The minister, Di Farmer, has to go. The Premier needs to stop squibbing these decisions and actually fronting up and realising that both herself needs to make the decisions, but also her ministers have to be held accountable. That's exactly what happened under a former LNP government in the child protection system, and it would certainly happen under another one.
Have any of the bureaucrats involved in these decisions, there are 3 there, I know there are more, have any of them lost their jobs? Has there been a clean out of the department responsible? Has there been any charges even laid against child protection officers who clearly should have been visiting these homes and weren't?
Well, look, Peter, this is the problem. We've heard nothing from the Premier in relation to these issues. These are hugely distressing issues, and it shows a clear problem in the child protection system here in Queensland. The Minister, Di Farmer, should have gone. The Premier should have stood up and sacked her minister immediately. These latest cases that have happened are just abhorrent, and, you know, we can't even look at some of the images and those poor darlings that lost their life. It shows there is a problem. In relation to the coronial inquest today, I understand there's around 21 officers who failed to do their duty. So there are many people that have some explaining to do, but the person that the buck stops with is the Premier of Queensland. She has been the Premier for the last 5 years, Peter. No more excuses. We've got to fix the system. People in Queensland deserve a health system that works. The people of Blackwater deserve to know when their community is being turned upside down, why that has happened, and that is why the Premier really needs to front up, stop palming it off to the health bureaucrats, actually make some decisions herself and stand by them.
Yeah, I also want to see some bloody heads roll in these sorts of cases too. I mean, ministers should be removed, absolutely, and if they're not removed, then premiers are removed at elections.
Away, Peter.
But all of these bureaucrats with protected jobs and higher salaries, and we know this debate that's going on about whether their pay gets increased at this time, they stay in perpetuity. They live longer than most governments do, and this stuff just goes on and on and on, and no one calls it into question. Look, just before we go, I want to go to the High Court challenge. The paperwork was lodged yesterday. This is in relation to the borders decision by the Premier to keep the borders closed. We know there are 6 plaintiffs. Queensland tourism companies and others are involved in the litigation. What I'm interested in is inside this litigation, in the papers lodged, is a real push for the disclosure of the health advice to the Chief Medical Officer in Queensland, because we know from public statements from the Chief Medical Officer at a federal level and his deputy that they never recommended borders be closed, and they certainly do not recommend they remain closed. So what on earth is the health advice the Premier's getting about borders?
Well, look, and that's a really good point. So, Peter, if I can take your listeners and yourself back to the decision that the Premier made around schools, very similar to the border, we now know that there was no health advice that said that those schools should be shut in Queensland. In fact, the Queensland Chief Health Officer actually said the decision to keep Queensland schools was made around messaging, not around the science or around the health. Now, the Premier backed the Chief Health Officer in and kept our schools shut. The same thing is happening with the border. And now you will also note that the Premier has used this Blackwater case as a justification to keeping our borders closed. So the Premier has some serious explaining to do to those business operators who are screaming. I was on the border at the Gold Coast, obviously on the Queensland side, just yesterday, and I can tell you there are businesses that are accommodation businesses that rely upon those southern tourists for that money that comes over the border every winter. And one of the concerns that those people had is if these people don't come and stay in Queensland this winter, we'll lose them. We'll lose them to places like Kingsland.
Well, correct, they'll go skiing and they'll never come back. says me.
Yeah, and that's the issue we've got.
That's a worry, and they haven't got a lot of spare cash at the moment. As you know, people have not got a lot of spare cash. It's not like they'll be having multiple holidays.
Yeah,